Welcome to Politics and Color and What Will the Experts Say? I'm Wilmer Leon. So here's the question. President Joe Biden's reelection campaign recently engaged in a full-on damage control the Monday following the president's disastrous debate performance, rejecting calls that he bow out and trying to convince voters that he's up for another term. If President Biden makes it through the convention, what concessions will he have to make in order to save his nomination? And what should African Americans and other communities of color be concerned about if, in fact, concessions must be made? Well, what will the experts say? Let's ask one. My guest is Dr. Gerald Horne. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
So recently, Texas Representative Lloyd Doggett has become the first Democratic lawmaker to break away from towing the party line. He is now publicly calling for President Biden to step aside and make way for what he calls new generation of leaders to unite the country. You've got Democratic lawmakers that were gathered on one of the calls that I referenced in the open to vent fears and frustration over the president's poor debate performance. Dr. Horne, how do you see this shaking out?
Well, number one, if Mr. Biden chooses to drop out, there's a legal question as to whether his tens of millions of campaign dollar funds can be transferred to Gavin Newsom or Governor Pritzker of Illinois, for example. And then there's a political question as to how his base will react if Vice President Kamala Harris is leapfrogged in this process and elbowed aside. But more than this, with regard to your original question concerning concessions, it's going to be difficult. Now, it's obvious that there needs to be added momentum to the George Floyd Policing Act, to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But the problem is that we're in the midst of a counter-revolutionary moment, which happens sporadically and occasionally and consistently in the United States of America, as evidenced by this spectacular U.S. Supreme Court decision of this week, which basically gives the incoming GOP president, as they see it, immunity if he wants to, as Justice Sotomayor put it, send a Navy SEAL to assassinate a political opponent, and even worse, tragedies and misdeeds. And therefore, given the fact that we're in the midst of this counter-revolutionary moment, given the fact that it takes 60 odd votes in the US Senate to push forward legislation, given the fact that Mr. Trump has a formidable base, 75 million strong in 2020, comprising a majority of the Euro-American vote across class lines, it's going to be difficult for concessions to be made. But then there's a wider point, dimly perceived. That is to say, there's a structural problem insofar as noted, the GOP is basically the party of neo-fascism. And what's oftentimes neglected is that the Democrats are the party of neo-imperialism, the party of foreign wars, as evidenced by Truman in Korea in the early 1950s, LBJ in Vietnam in the 1960s, et cetera. The contradiction for the Black voter is that they feel that in order to block the rise of fascism, they have to cling to the apron strings of the party of neo-imperialism. The problem there is that historically, in order to block the party of fascism, and recall it was not so long ago that the Democrats had an armed wing called the Ku Klux Klan, and it wasn't until the 1930s under FDR that there was this shift from Black people who could vote, shifting from the GOP to the Democrats, which has continued to this very moment. But historically, going back to the bad old days of slavery, we needed international assistance to get us over the hump, to escape slavery by dint of the ripples sent forth by the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, to escape Jim Crow, as evidenced by the ripples sent forth from the rise of a socialist camp in the 20th century, then reaching out to national liberation movements in Africa and the Caribbean, Washington finding it difficult to win hearts and minds in these resource-rich nations and continents, while Black people are treated so atrociously, that creates a dynamic that leads to the retreat of Jim Crow. And so, to put it in a nutshell, the problem is that by casting our lot with the party of foreign wars, the party of neo-imperialism, we're basically handcuffing ourselves as we think we're voting to block fascism. There is the dimly perceived contradiction of the Black vote in 2024.
And another element of that contradiction, I would suggest, is there are many in the community that say, oh, you got to vote for Biden. If you don't vote for Biden, you're voting for Trump. If you vote for Dr. West, or if you vote for Robert Kennedy, you're voting for Trump. You also have those that say the primary issue is the judiciary, that we've got to vote for judges. And I say, but wait a minute, what about genocide? Do any of you all have a problem with this problem? Do you have a problem with this problem in Gaza called genocide? And so this binary thinking, I have found, and I wrote a piece a while ago called The Dangers of Binary Thinking in the African-American Community. This binary thinking, I believe, limits us to the either or. It's not black and white. It's varying shades of gray.
Well, it's also an organizational problem. That is to say, in order to escape this contradiction, to escape from the present wilderness, we need organizational leadership. That should come ideally from the NAACP, but we know that in the transition from Jim Crow to what we have today, they made a devil's bargain, a Faustian bargain, to throw overboard their internationalist leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and his comrade Paul Robeson, and therefore they are ill-positioned to make the kinds of alliances, for example, with regard to anti-genocide that your comment just suggested. So as of 2024, it appears that the Black vote and the Black voter are trapped.
And as Politics in Color is focused on articulating those issues in 30 seconds, in a nutshell, what are the primary issues that you see that are facing communities of color with this? Will we wind up with Joe Biden at the end of the August convention?
Well, that answer was foreshadowed in my earlier comments when I made reference to congressional legislation concerning voting rights, when I made reference to congressional legislation regarding police terror. I could have added a footnote with regard to reparations, with regard to the descendants of enslaved Africans. But once again, speaking realistically, this kind of legislation has to overcome a formidable hurdle in Congress, which then leads us to the courts, because in light of this disastrous, catastrophic Supreme Court decision on Trump's immunity of a day or two ago, you've had these legal eagles talking about changing the Constitution as if you can just snap your fingers and do that. They've talked about term limits for Supreme Court justices, not explaining why the Trump senators will go along with this. And so there's a lot of magical thinking taking place in this country, but I dare say that it's a product of the fact that there is a dimly perceived perception that we're trapped, and that therefore it leads to magical thinking and hysteria.
Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you so much for giving me your time today and providing us with this analysis. As always, greatly, greatly appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Folks, thank you for tuning to Politics in Color and watching What Do the Experts Think? Remember, if you want to join the conversation, it's here on Politics in Color. I'm Wilmer Leon.